All right, hello and welcome to OutRaised Voices. I'm your host, Sharon Lee Williams, and I'm so glad, as I always say all the time, I'm glad you're here. Thank you for showing up again if you've been here before. And if you're new to the show, thank you for coming. I appreciate you, and I know you're going to enjoy this wonderful show and learn. That's what we're here to do. We're here to learn. Our CEOs bring conversation, education, and outreach. So that's what we're doing today. And I'm keeping it brief today. So thank you. Our CEO today is Mariama Lockington. Now, Mariama is an author, she's an educator, and a transracial adoptee. But it doesn't stop there. You know, there's no period after that because she writes poetry. And I wanted to ask her, I think I got this wrong. I know you're at the University of Kentucky, but I'm not sure as a level of professor, University of Kentucky.
Oh, no, I'm a staff member.
A staff member? Okay.
Yes,
She's a staff member at the University of Kentucky and the winner of the 2024 Schneider Family Book Award. So Mariama is just Mariama. She's all that and a bag of chips, as they say. So, okay. Mariama is going to share her journey through being a transracial adoptee to becoming the person she's grown up to become. And we're going to hear the journey we're going to hear her journey. And I guess that's where we'll start. Hi, Mariama. And thank you for being here. So I'm going to jump right into this. I want to take you back to your first memory of being with your adoptive family.
Well, that's a great question. Well, first of all, thank you for having me, Sharon Lee. It's a pleasure. And thank you for that lovely introduction. The first memory. So I was born in 1984. I'm an 80s baby. Or a dowager millennial, as I like to say. Elder millennial is what the newspapers are calling us, but dowager just sounds, I don't know, it sounds more fancy.
Oh, gosh, I have to keep up.
I know, I'm approaching, we're in our 40s now. So, we're elder millennials, dowager millennials. But I was born in 1984 in Atlanta, in Georgia. And I was in foster care for about 3 weeks before I was adopted. And I was actually not in the same state as my adoptive family. So I was actually flown across the country by a social worker, and I met my adoptive family in the airport in Colorado for the very first time. Now, I don't have memories of that moment as a tiny baby, but I do have pictures because there were a lot of pictures snapped of that moment of my parents, who are white, meeting me in the airport. I was wearing like a little red Santa-inspired onesie. And there's also a picture with a blonde social worker that was the one who flew with me across the country. So that is maybe a first image I have of sort of me arriving and being welcomed, greeted by my parents, who at the time lived in Colorado as I came from Atlanta.
So you were what age?
I was 3 weeks old when I was on a plane.
So you were 3. Oh, I don't know why I remembered you as being old. So you were in care from birth. You were so you spent your first 3 weeks of life in care in Atlanta, in a foster home in Atlanta, and then you were. I always want to say the word chosen. I don't know if that's the right word, but you were chosen and became a gift to this family in another state.
Yeah. I think gift is often a word that's used. For me, it's also important to say that I was separated from my family of origin because it is I was very young and I was a baby, but it was a separation from biological family, which we can talk more about later. But yeah, I was actually, the reason I know I was in foster care is because in my very limited file that I have, there's actually, maybe 4 pages of stapled handwritten notes from my foster mother. Do not know who this woman was. Do not have memories beyond this little, artifact. But she kept a daily log of me as an infant and a newborn, and said I was a happy baby, and, how much I ate and how much I needed diaper changes. And so it's very limited, but I do know that I was in the care of some woman for my first 3 weeks who took
cared. Who cared.
And then I was, my parents, they had heard about the adoption agency through they had close friends who had adopted another little girl. And so I think they had initiated the process after talking with their friends. And then I was flown across the country, which is maybe not something I hear very much for domestic adoptees. Definitely, if you are a transnational adoptee, there is some type of travel, obviously. But yeah, I have my very first pictures that then become sort of these memories or part of the narrative of my adoption, from being in the airport, my parents at the gate, because you could come to the gate then, waiting for me, and then us in, airport seats, them holding me. And I was their first child. So they had struggled to get pregnant before adopting me. And so I am the eldest of now 4 children, which we can talk about in a little bit. But I was baby number 1, and they met me at the airport.
4 adopted children, or 4?
So 3 adopted children, including myself, and then they have 1 biological child. Yeah.
You hear that often, right? People adopt, and then all of a sudden they're not all of a sudden they're able to become pregnant on their own. Very, very interesting. So, I guess one of the questions in my head, I mean, that it is for later, but I might jump back and forth in terms of, I've always wanted to understand. I know you work with families who adopt outside their race, or adults who have been adopted outside their race. And I always had the question in my mind, do families tell you why they've chosen to adopt outside of their race or culture?
That's such a good question. I think, so a lot of my work with adoption is actually, I'm more focused on working with and alongside fellow adoptees, whether transracial or not, transnational. I find a lot of joy in that particular work. In my writing for young people who might be adoptees or might have multiracial families. But I have done some work with adoptive parents through different organizations where I've sat on panels, or I've led workshops for prospective or current adoptive parents who are white and maybe adopting transracially. I think it's interesting because often what I hear and what I heard from my own parents was, oh, race didn't matter. We just wanted a little baby. And so it didn't matter. And I think that comes from I don't think that comes from a bad place of like, it didn't matter to us what she looked like. But I do think that for me in my own journey as an adoptee growing up, a transracial adoptee, that actually was not helpful to me to just hear like, oh, we didn't even think about it, because, I think my parents and possibly other adoptive parents think that that's an accepting, loving thing to say, to adopt like a colorblind attitude, right? You're just the same as, my sister who came along 2.5 years later and who's my parents' biological child. But the reality of it is I'm not just the same, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it is an important difference. The way that I was walking through the world as an elementary school student was very different than the way my sister, who was born a couple of years after I came along, was walking through the world. My experience was also very different from the way my parents were walking through the world. And so I think that's something I hear a lot, right? It didn't matter to us. We just wanted a baby, and we just, occasionally I hear people saying, I know there are a lot of young Black children specifically who are either
needing homes and
who need homes. And So that's a reason. And then there are parents who, don't necessarily plan to adopt transracially, but, go to an agency or a private adoption and are sort of, um, you know, influenced to, we've got, this child available right now or this potential match for you. And so I think it really
It
depends.
depends on.
Yeah, and I do think every case is probably different and there's nuance,
Yes.
and some people are dealing with infertility and this is the route that they've come, and that's nuanced and tricky too. And then, I think my mom told me once that she saw Martin Luther King speak and just always knew she wanted to adopt a child of color, a Black child. And this was from a very long ago conversation. So I don't have a ton of memory of it.
Because I've spoken with parents who have adopted within their race, or I had a friend of mine whose daughter is biracial because that was her husband is white and she was Black, and they wanted someone who represented their family, as well as another woman, Robin, who adopted within the white race because she felt comfortable doing that. And it is, of course, easier to do that for the child as well as the parents. So I guess there are a number of answers to that, why people do that. And I could see somebody saying, yes, I've watched Martin Luther King, but being colorblind, when, it's a learning. We're all learning,
Yeah.
because even as adults, we hear people say, I don't see color.
Yeah. And I think it's a really common thing to hear. I
Yes.
will say that in more recent years, maybe in the past 5-7 years, when I have done work with adoptive parents, it's really important for me to say, obviously you want to love your child and you want to understand their experiences, but also you have to get comfortable with being uncomfortable with the things you just are not going to know, right?
Right.
And it's not a failure, and it's
Right.
not something for you to take personally and sort of internalize, but it's something to know that that no matter how much you may love your child that you've
Yes.
adopted, who is not the same race as you, you're not going to be able to protect them from everything, and you're not going to be able to fully understand their experiences. But the most
Right.
important thing that you can do, even if you're uncomfortable, is when they come to you and say, hey, this person on the playground told me I was only half human because they saw that the palms were a different color than the rest of my hand. Instead of to brush that aside or get uncomfortable, is to say, I believe you. How did that make you feel? Right? To ask questions and not dismiss it and say, oh, I'm sure they didn't mean that. Right. And so that is something that I feel like more so has been a conversation. It's like, how do I show up
Yes.
for my child of color, for my Black child, because I am realizing that our experiences are not the same.
Yeah, that, like you say, it's conversation and education, because people don't know. We think it's all going to be. I don't know what people think. Actually, I shouldn't say that. But even as an adoptee, or anytime you're raised outside of your family of origin or culture, I mean, there is. Even if you're with the most loving family, which I've learned, the most loving family, at some point there seems to be right around 20 when you're heading out into the world. It's like, where do I belong? And it doesn't matter if you're raised within the race or anything. Who are my people? Where do I? There's always that space there. There's that space that says, who am I?
Who am I?
Who am I? So, when you talk about being on the school ground, did you go to church? Was church part of your experience?
It wasn't. I was not raised religiously, although, there were spiritual practices, and, my dad practiced yoga and meditation. And, I like to say in some ways that music was a form of spirituality in
Yeah,
my
I was going to go
life
there.
growing
Yeah.
up. Because while I did not grow up going to church on Sundays,
Yes.
what I did grow up doing is Fridays and Saturday nights. My father was a cellist and a singer and a piano player, but mostly he was a conductor of orchestras. And so
Oh, beautiful.
often Friday or Saturdays or both evenings, we would get on our concert dresses and we would go to the symphony and watch our dad
Oh,
conduct on stage and then scurry backstage during the intermission
oh,
and
how
say hi to the
wonderful.
musicians. And so that was a part of that was like a very consistent part of growing up, was going to concerts, being exposed to the arts in all forms, but specifically music, and watching both my parents progress in their careers, but then also moving around a lot, because as he
Yes.
got more jobs from, associate music
Hmm.
director to music director, we moved from Colorado to various different places all over the country for
Hmm.
his career mainly.
So there I see you taking on this family value. They're creatives and
Mhm.
you're a creative.
Correct. Yes.
So do you ever wonder, because I know you're in the process of looking for your biological parents. I mean, that something comes up in your head and goes, I wonder if they're, my biologicals were creative. I mean, or do we just take on this family, we're there and we take
Yeah.
that on, and it's a beautiful part of it. I mean, that's awesome.
Yeah, so
Awesome.
it's the nature versus nurture conversation, right? Does that come
Yes.
from,
Thank you for saying
DNA
that. Yeah.
and passed down, or is it from, just the environment I grew up in? I do know from, again, I have a file from the adoption agency that's non-identifying information. So it doesn't have names or addresses or anything.
Mm-hmm.
But I do know that my biological mother was a singer and enjoyed singing in her church choir. So I do know
All right.
that little fact. And that to me is a huge form of creativity and self.
Yes.
So, yeah.
Yes. Yes. Um, so I wanted to ask, while you were growing up, did you have a mentor? Who became your mentor within that situation? It's not, I don't want to say situation. It's your family. It's
Yeah,
your family dynamic.
correct.
So did you have a mentor within your family, or within your outside of your family, and were you around other black families, or?
Um, so yes and no. I mean, I think growing up in the 80s and 90s, which were the primary parts of my childhood,
Hmm.
I was not around Black families very much. I was around other children who were adopted. So
Hmm.
I don't know if these count as mentors because they're sort of peer mentors, I guess, but
Yes,
there are
yes.
three well, they're not, they're grown adult women now, but there were
Hmm.
three Black girls growing up from, toddlerhood through high school that were very important to me as
Hmm.
a Black adoptee. And they were also all Black adoptees. So I think I mentioned when I was adopted from the same agency as my parents' friends. And
Hmm.
that little girl and I kind of grew up together, at least in Colorado. And she
Hmm.
was also a Black adoptee from the same agency. And we've stayed in each other's lives. We
Hmm.
don't talk every day, but I went to her wedding and we've stayed in each other's lives over the year. And so having that friend as a young person, especially in elementary school, and
Hmm.
being able to say, oh, well, her family looks a little like my family, was really important to me. Um,
Hmm.
and
Do
then
you have the conversation with her about blackness and being within that environment, or that when
Not
does
so
that come up?
much, not so much with her, because again, we were very young, and our relationship now is, I think will always care about each other and be able to get in contact with each other, but we're not close on an everyday
Oh,
basis.
okay.
I
Okay.
think the next friend that I had that I met in sort of upper elementary, middle school, and I like to say this because my first book is not memoir, but it's based on my experiences growing up as a Black adoptee. The friendship in that book is very much inspired by my friendship with this friend that I have when we lived in Baltimore.
Hmm.
And so she was an adoptee from Brazil, and we met in an adoptee like play group. And we became such fast friends. And then when we moved away from, again, we moved to New Mexico. Um, we were pen pals for years and years and years. We would visit each other, and we were at each other's weddings. And, you know, whenever I can, I try to see her, and we're still in contact to this day. And she's someone who, because it was upper elementary into middle school, you know, I didn't always have the language to talk about exactly the things that were happening to me or I was experiencing, right? I didn't know what a microaggression was.
Right.
I just know that I felt weird or uncomfortable or some violence sometime when people said things to me or whatever. But we had this strong bond because we were like, oh, well, our families are the same, essentially. And, you know, we would do make believe and talk about our lives in the future and what we would want to do. And then into teenagehood, it also became really important to talk about how we were starting to form our identity around our Black identities, for her transnational identities, and how we were, you know, talking about all the things teenage girls talk about. And then also, you know, knowing like I have this BFF who, even though we don't live in the same place, I know she's still there and she's read my books. And
oh, that's cool.
Yeah. So I have people like that. And then I had another really dear friend who I met in high school. And she and I definitely talked about being awkward Black girls. And,
so how do you identify with being a Black? What does that mean when you said we're talking about when identifying with being a Black girl? What does that look like? Is it in music? Is it in dress? Is it in what does that look like for you?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me it was. I mean, now I know that there's not one way to be a Black person, right? Like, you know, there are stereotypes, but no Black, we're not a monolith in the same way adoptees are not a monolith. So I know that now. But I think as a young person, I did try on certain things to try to figure out what made me Black, right? And I knew it's not, you know, I wasn't adopted by someone who's my same race. So there was never a secret that I was adopted or that I was Black. I knew that. But I also did not have a lot of adult role models in my like everyday life in my community who were Black people, maybe until high school. I didn't really have that. So for me, yes, music. I in particular got really attached to Black jazz singers. Like I still to this day, Billie Holiday, Ella Fitzgerald, Nina Simone. Those are, you know, even as a little girl, I was like listening to those Adams, Natalie Cole. And
were your parents listening to that type of music as well?
Really.
Not at all. Okay.
Not really. I mean,
were you playing it in the house or you're not playing it?
Yeah, or I was buying at a time where I could buy my own CDs or tapes and listen on a Walkman or a CD player. But I really got attached to that particular type of music. I will also say that it felt safer to get attached, and this is a nuance. It felt safer to get attached to that type of music because my parents, even though they weren't listening to it on a daily basis, they considered it music. Now, when I started listening to rap or hip hop or, you know, other forms of music, they were a little less okay with that and a little more judgmental.
I think that's standard.
Yeah.
Could be across the board with
across the board. Parents. But I love all types of music, right? So, you know, Lauryn Hill is one of my top 5 albums, The Miseducation of Lauryn Hill. So anyway, so yeah, that was a way through music, right? And I think, you know, through dress sometimes, but I think that's normal. You're trying to find your style and your what you like as a young person. And I think another way that I tried to connect is through cooking and learning how to make dishes that maybe more traditionally show up in Black families and Black cultures. And I love to cook.
What's your favorite dish to make?
Well, okay. Oh, I have a lot of favorite dishes. I mean, I have like a comfort dish when I just need comfort. I make salmon and rice and veggies. I do on New Year's, I do black-eyed peas, greens, and pork and cornbread. On Christmas, I do a braised, short ribs that are like miso braised. Like, so now I do lots of different things.
You do lots of things.
Yeah.
So See, I said I knew there was going to be a
I know.
lot to
Sorry.
talk about with
Cut
you.
me off.
So, what does rebel Mariana look like as a teenager? Did you rebel at all?
I think that's complicated because something that, and I'm again, we're not a monolith, but something that often happens with adoptees is a lot of overachieving, a lot of perfectionism, and a fear of if we're not what our parents bargained for, then are we going to be given back? Are we going to
Yeah.
be thrown
Yeah.
away in some capacity, right? And so
Yes. Yes.
no, I mean, I absolutely was a teenager and did all the things and experimented with all the things that teenagers often do. But I was also a young person who really craved structure and routine and rules. And in my family growing up, yes, we were all artistic and people are very talented. But for me, there was a lot of chaos as well. Um, I was I was homeschooled, but not really homeschooled, sort of unschooled from second through high school. I missed a lot of important math. I missed a lot of things that I needed. We moved around a lot. Um, and I have family members who struggle with mental health as well. And so I spent a lot of childhood and young adulthood sometimes feeling like, well, who's the adult here? And with a lot of anxiety. I also live with chronic anxiety, so with a lot of anxiety. And so for me, not being in school felt horrible. I did not like homeschooling. Not having a structure to my day sometimes, my parents were very much like, we're gonna have a farm, go check on the chickens and wander around. So I think my rebellion actually was after some sort of moving around in middle and elementary school and not feeling like there was a lot of structure, or sometimes feeling unsafe, or not understanding the different things adults in my family were going through. I think high school came along and we moved. We moved from New Mexico to Michigan. My dad got yet another job. And my parents sat us down, and the only thing I said to them was like, I don't care if we move. I will be going to high school. And what I didn't say to them is I had made myself a whole plan on how to be a normal, teenager. Like, I was going to go to school. I was going to get a boyfriend who played a varsity sport. I was going to get a group of friends. I was going to wear cool clothes. I was going to get my braces off, and I was going to join, high school clubs and sports. And I was going to be like,
normal,
right? And the stuff going on in my family regarding mental health and stability, and the stuff going on as far as people not recognizing me as part of my family when we're out in public, that stuff was gonna be secondary to like me being a normal teenage girl.
So when you say, I want to go back a little bit, because when you say your parents, of course, didn't understand what, or maybe they understood but weren't ready to talk about it, or didn't want to talk about it because maybe they think that would have a lot of impact on you, but by not talking about it, you were impacted. Did your parents ever tell you that they got flack for adopting a Black child?
Yes, I think later in life they did. And I think there were moments in my childhood where maybe my mom didn't say so much to me, but where I felt the tension or uncomfortableness, in people's way they treated us. I know there is a story from childhood where, typical, you're a kid, his preschool age, you're on the playground and your parent says it's time to go and you throw a tantrum. And I do know that I did that at one point. And my mom, started pulling me away, dragging and screaming. And there was a Black family that came up and said, "Hey, is that your kid?" Right. I do know there are stories like that. But I think we, as much as I knew I was Black, I knew I was adopted, I think my parents did try with the tools that they had. Maybe at the time, I would find Black history books just on my bed. But I think the hard part about that is it didn't feel like it was something that was ingrained in our family. Like, we talk about these things, like we talk about what the civil rights movement was. It was very much like, well, this is something Mariama will need, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so in a way I felt alone in some of it because um there was an acknowledgement, but then there wasn't a like discussion. How does this manifest in our day to day? What do we talk about these people? So I think that was a little difficult growing up sometime. Was
Mm-hmm.
not always feeling like I could go to my parents. Like, if they, left me a history book and I saw something in it, was it okay to go to them and say, hey, I'm
Mm-hmm.
really bothered by this, or I'm thinking about this.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So writing really became a way for me to
Mm-hmm.
process my
Yeah.
identity and the big questions I had and the grief that I had around,
Mm-hmm.
I from a very, it's not even just when I turned 20, there's a moment of coming out of the fog when you're an adoptee. But
Mm-hmm.
I, from a very young age, was writing poems and questions about, who am I? Who do I look like?
Mm-hmm.
What did my mom smell like? I have all these poems and writings from very young age, feeling a lot of grief and isolation from not knowing that, but also not feeling like I could take that to my parents because it would be a betrayal. That's how I felt.
Yeah,
Um,
I understand
yeah,
that. I
yeah.
absolutely understand that. I